Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey. What is going on, everybody? I'm always excited about episodes of the podcast, and this week I'm really excited about it. I had the great pleasure, the great good fortune, the great favor of interviewing Amber O'Hearn. And if people are familiar with Amber's work in the carnivore space, they will be chomping at the bit for this episode, and they'll probably just skip by my whole intro because they don't want to hear me, they want to hear Amber. But Amber is an amazing, amazing woman. She's a data scientist by profession with a background in math, computer science, linguistics, and psychology. Perhaps you could say she's a polymath. She's definitely brilliant. She always brings amazing ideas to the space. And just like so many others in the space who are contributing right now, who are not physicians, I love the perspective that these folks bring. And they are certainly bringing unique, creative perspectives. So many of us trained as physicians are just trained to be so myopic, and we often can't see it. So I appreciate everything that Amber brings to the space. She's been studying and experimenting with low-carb and ketogenic diets since 1997. That's before many of you were born. She has been eating a plant-free diet since 2009, and in the last number of years has been writing and speaking about her findings regarding ketogenic diets and plant-free diets, otherwise known as carnivorous diets. Interestingly, her review on the evolutionary appropriateness and benefits of weaning babies onto a meat-based, high-fat, low-carb diet was included as testimony defending Professor Tim Noakes in his recent trial, which was just a travesty, and thankfully he was cleared. But Amber has been a big player in this space. I'm pretty sure the O in her last name stands for OG because she is the original gangster in this space, and we all owe so much to her. In the time that I have been learning about the carnivore diet, she was one of the first people that I looked to. Her blogs, which are ketotic.org and Empirica. The Empirica is EMPIRI.ca, have been amazing resources for me and many others throughout the process of learning about carnivory. She is writing a book called Facultative Carnivore. You can find some of that work and the first few chapters on her website regarding that, which is facultativecarnivore.com. I will link to all of this in the show notes. We talk about so many cool things in this interview. I think you guys are going to dig this one. We talk about the RDAs. We talk about specific micronutrients. We talk about potential pitfalls. We talk about fat to protein ratios. It was amazing. We were sitting outside of KetoCon in Austin, so there was probably some melodic chirping of birds in the background. And at one point, there was somebody yelling about something they were excited about outside. So I apologize about that, but I do not think it takes away from the overall amazing quality of this interview. You guys know what else I think is amazing? The Fundamental Health Insider. You should go to my website, paulsaladinomd.com/insider, and sign up if you're not a member. I'm sending out newsletters about every week or so in which I talk about an article. I talk about other good stuff. Check out my Insider. It is where the cool kids hang out. I deliver good value there. I talk about what's going on here on the podcast, etc. Fundamental Health Insider, which is at paulsaladinomd.com/insider to become one of the cool kids. The other thing that I think is amazing is that Ancestral Supplements continues to sponsor this podcast. They are at ancestralsupplements.com. And the reason I so much appreciate these guys is because they are making grass-fed, desiccated, which is low-temperature dehydrated supplements from organs of animals in New Zealand. You guys know that I love nose to tail. It is so hard to get all of these organs into our lives. I can maybe do it occasionally. When I'm traveling, it's impossible. For a lot of other people who don't like the taste of organs, it's much better just to do it this way. And these supplements preserve much of the nutritional content of these organs, and having them in your diet is going to improve your health radically. You know, I love that word, especially if you cannot eat the real organs. They have everything from gallbladder to kidney to brain to liver to organ complex. I think there are so many applications for these, and I'm so excited these guys are on the market, and I appreciate them sponsoring the podcast. So go to ancestralsupplements.com see what they can do for you. If you go to their Shopify page, the code SaladinoMD will get you 10% off, I believe. I have been digging my Juve Light. I am filming with these guys next week for a page on their website. I'm stoked about that. I've got a full body Juve now. I've got the Elite, and I use it in the morning and at night. It's so relaxing. There's so much cool research about this. I'm going to be talking about it way more in the future. Okay, so that is the Juve. www.juve.com/Paul. Without further ado, on to the show. Check this one out, you guys, and you will love it. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Amber, it's a pleasure.
Hi, Paul. It's really great to finally meet you in person.
I know. We've been sort of orbiting each other for so long, and I've been a fan of your work for a long time, so I really appreciate you coming on. People may or may not know this, but when I started doing Carnivore about a year ago, a lot of your stuff was the first stuff that I found, and many of your talks and many of your presentations and your website. What's the main website that you curate?
Well, I have ketotic.org,
right,
which is mostly about ketogenic diets, but then the carnivore stuff is mostly on Empirica.
I think I've seen both, and they were both so helpful for me in the beginning, and I'm sure lots of people have found you. Now, I want to hear your story again. I'm sure you've told it many times, but it's such an interesting one that I think people will appreciate it. But we just started recording, and I want to ask you about this before we go anywhere. You said that you use one of these voice recorders for your voice lessons. So you're singing.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. I've always liked singing. I've always loved singing. And there was a point when I was maybe around 12 when I wanted to have voice lessons because I thought if I were going to go on with music that was necessary. And it wasn't something I had access to. And so I kind of gave up on it. And it was only in my 40s when I realized, wait a second, I can do anything that I want, and I started taking voice lessons just a couple of years ago, and it's really made a huge difference for me in that aspect of my life.
What sort of stuff do you do? Like, what do you sing, or what's it like? Where can we see it, Amber? Where can we hear it?
Well, there's not much available. I do have some stuff on SoundCloud with the kind of idea behind it is I'm going to learn and I'm going to publicly demonstrate that I went from this level of being able to sing to a higher level. So there's kind of stuff that I wouldn't normally publish if I were just trying to show off my skills. But I also sing backup vocals in a punk band locally in Boulder, Colorado. But when I'm just singing for myself, it's usually more folk stuff. Carole King I really like, and Kate Bush.
Awesome. That's so cool. What's the name of the punk band you're in?
Niwat's Curse.
That's amazing. I love it. So when we're at the Boulder Carnivore Con next year, we're going to have to come and see Niwat's Curse.
I'll see if I can arrange to play.
Do you think they'll play at the Carnivore Conference?
It's not out of the realm of possibility, but it's a little bit unlikely.
Well, let's dig into your story a little bit. So, and I know I've heard you say that you had psychiatric issues. It's very interesting for me from the perspective of psychiatry. Like, where does it all start for you? Where does it start, and where does carnivore come in, and what did you experience? Like, tell us your story.
Well, thanks for asking me to tell it, because although I have told it many times, I look at it a bit differently than I used to. I used to really tell it as a weight loss story, and there is that. But the more that I looked back, the more I realized that the times that I was struggling the most with my weight were often the times that I was also having the most psychiatric difficulties, and I never really connected them. Even after all I've been through, I never connected them in quite the way that I realized I should have when I looked back at it. So I started having depression clinically in my first year of university. It was a very tough year for me for many reasons. I also gained a lot of weight that year. I went on antidepressants, and I doubled down on my vegetarianism. I wasn't really a vegetarian going in, but I was brought up vegetarian. And so when I started having troubles, that was the first place that I looked. It seemed really obvious to me that it was just obvious because that was what I thought that I knew. And so I got strict with vegetarianism, I started exercising more, and none of these things really helped. Well, I mean, there's only one of me, so maybe it would have been worse without. And then I was looking on the internet. We had internet. We didn't have the World Wide Web back then. It was the early 90s.
It was called the internet. The interweb.
Yeah, no web. I remember actually, just a side note, the first time that I heard on the radio a website URL, and they very carefully said www. That's 3 W's, because nobody knew what the heck that was. But there were forums for people to talk about things, and diet was one of the things that people like to talk about. And there were 3 main fora for diet. There was diet for just general, diet for low carb, and diet for low fat. So I heard about low carb then, but I immediately dismissed it as, the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. So, but that seed was there. So later, when I had gone to study Russian in Russia, and when I was there, I started eating meat. I had gone so far as to go vegan before I left, and it was just very, very difficult to do while I was in Europe in a foreign country, and I decided, okay, I'm just going to put this on hold and go back to figuring out my health when I get home. But I actually lost weight while I was there. Now, there could be many reasons for that, but that gave me the impetus to rethink. And it was right at that moment, basically, that the Eads had released their book, Protein Power. And so I devoured that book and changed my diet and lost the weight that was bothering me. And I felt great and I felt happy, but I didn't really connect it as a mood thing. Now, if we fast forward, that was in 97. So 12 years later, basically, I had 2 children, and I had maintained this low-carb diet, but first of all, I had started gaining weight again, and even though I was very strict with the diet, it didn't seem to help very much. And that could have been because of pregnancies, it could have been because of aging, I really don't know. But what was going on that was really making my life miserable was that this depression, which had been, first of all, reclassified to major depressive disorder, treatment resistant, so meaning nothing's helping. It would come and go, but the quality of it started changing, and I was having, first of all, more, the cycles of the changes of my mood were becoming more rapid, and the quality of the moods were changing. So in addition to having just depression, I was having these periods of hypomania, which is basically like mania, but without psychosis. And so you're starting to feel really euphoric, talking a lot, being excited, getting these, I wouldn't say grander, but really cool ideas. It's actually, hypomania is fantastic. I think it's the goal in some ways. But in the context in which I was experiencing it really wasn't healthy. And then I was also having these things like irritability and where my body's feeling up as if I'm not depressed, but the character of the upness was negative instead of positive. And so because of all of that, I got re-diagnosed with a form of bipolar disorder. And I was really happy about that change of diagnosis at first, even though it sounds like a way worse thing, because I thought, oh, this is why none of the treatments have worked, because I was just on the wrong treatment. And so I initially had a lot of optimism about a new way to treat what was going on, but the drugs for bipolar are worse than the disease. It was brutal. Horrible.
What did you get put on?
There were at least 3 different ones, maybe 4, and I can't remember exactly which ones they were. One of them caused Word retrieval error. I suppose I'm still having that. No, but seriously, like for a person who's super verbal the way that I am, to suddenly not be able to find common words was alarming. There's one that gave me what are called brain zaps. It's just this feeling of like a shock going down the back of your head every now and then. It was kind of also disquieting. I tried Seroquel, which is not a traditional antipsychotic, and it put me to sleep like a zombie. Like I just basically was in bed all day, which is not much better than being depressed. and Abilify, what a name. I tried that, and it gave me such intense anxiety that I basically believed that either I or one of my children was going to die at any minute. They go out to play, and I just sort of resigned myself. Well, it's the last time I'll see that one.
Have fun on the swings. I'll never see you again.
It was pretty horrible. Yeah, so it was in the midst of all that I found, I guess this was the end of 2008, and I had begun to feel desperate all the time. I was always looking for the answer, and so, I was constantly reading testimonials from this or that supplement, and felt like, what is my missing piece? And I saw this forum called Zeroing In on Health, and there were people talking about doing an all-meat diet, which seemed kind of a little bit extreme, but many of them had a background similar to mine in that they were on a low-carb diet, but it just wasn't getting them all the way. But when they found that when they went on this all-meat diet, which they called zero carbs, EC, they would lose the weight. And I thought, well, that's something I could do for a couple months, and then obviously I wasn't maintaining my weight loss, but it was very slow, the weight gain. So I figured worst case, I could go back to my low carb diet and then every once in a while tune up with this zero carb idea, if it worked for me. And what was really surprising to me was just psychologically how much it took for me to actually try it. I actually read the forum and studied and planned for about 3 whole weeks before I did my first carnivore experiment, and the experiment was only going to last 3 weeks. I thought, can I really do this? I thought it was going to be boring, and I don't know, I don't think I had any particular expectations, but it just seemed unfathomable to not have any salad or vegetables on the plate. But I finally tried it, and I started losing weight right away, which was great, really good feedback. But what I found was that my mood was really, really good. Now, part of that is probably because, yay, I'm having success, and that's great for the mood. Sure. But it was different, qualitatively different. And I brought it up with my husband. When you have bipolar disorder, you start to train yourself not to trust your emotions. Yeah, sure, I feel great now, but how am I going to feel tomorrow? And even the clinical, when you go in to get, the briefing, you and your disease, right? There's a lot of, they tell you, don't trust yourself. And they tell the people that you're living with not to take you seriously in a certain way, which is really damaging. It may be necessary, but it's not good for relationships.
Right? Yeah.
So I brought it up with my husband, and he stopped what he was doing and said, I haven't known how to bring this up with you, but your mood, the stability of your mood, I don't think I've ever seen you this stable in our entire marriage, which was at almost 10 years at that time. So I knew that something serious was going on. And that was in 2 weeks.
Happened fast.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I try to remember. If I'm ever doing anything different or experimenting with something or having a trouble now, I remember that probably the worst case scenario is I'll be messed up for a couple weeks.
Right? Yeah.
Not that I can afford a couple weeks. Sometimes people ask me if I have tried reintroducing things into the diet, and for the most part, I haven't. In part because of all the research that I've done, I feel like I'm safe. There's nothing that's going to go terribly wrong with what I'm doing. But also, it's surprising to me that my interest just hasn't been there. I loved vegetables. I'm not one of these people who was like, good riddance, vegetables. I loved even the lowly broccoli and turnip and spinach, all that. But I don't miss it. And so I haven't spent a lot of time trying to reintroduce.
I remember I read that on your website. I think it was Empirica. You said, I thought I would be bored and I wasn't. And I think people come to a carnivore diet from all different perspectives. My overgeneralization is that many men say, yeah, I just get to eat animal products. And I'm a fan of no acetyl carnivore, but I think a lot of guys think, oh, I just get to eat steak all the time. And I was talking to Ken Berry's wife, and she said, carnivore makes me feel the best, but I don't like the lack of variety. Mm-hmm. And so I think that for some people, women or some men too, they're concerned about the lack of variety in food. So it's really interesting to hear from you that you thought you were going to be bored, but then once you got into it, you weren't really. And now you don't really crave the vegetables or want them back. I think there's a lot of mental mindset, a lot of mindset around this for people when they're thinking about animal-based diets or putting more animal foods in their diet or thinking about letting go of plant foods. And it's just the concern that they're not going to have enough entertainment from the food. But many people in the carnivore space, I think, once they get into it, are happy to let the plant foods go. They don't need them back, surprisingly, in many cases.
It is surprising, and I think that it maybe really does take a complete elimination of things like spices and sweeteners to really get to that point, because I think those things perpetuate the desire for variety. Now, I feel like my diet has a lot of variety in it. I'll eat chicken thighs, I'll eat pork belly, I'll eat pork chops, I eat lamb chops, I do eat organ meats. I know that a lot of people in the carnivore world are thriving without organ meats, and I think that's something that we need to pay attention to. It's probably not an accident. But I happen to love liver. I discovered brain last year, and I know for a lot of people that's where they draw the line, and that's fine, but I love it. It's mild tasting and creamy. So I like organs. And I really don't feel the desire for other things. It's interesting.
It is interesting. How do you cook your brain?
I usually scramble it. I've tried it in a kind of meatloaf formulation. I have eaten it raw, and I like that too, but I'm a little bit cautious with raw foods, even though I think there's a possibility that there are some benefits to eating raw. I've mentioned this on social media, but I actually had 2 different bouts of food poisoning last year. I had Campylobacter, which is probably from not raw, but rare chicken hearts. And then I also had Salmonella, which was absolutely devastating, knocked me out. And I'm not even sure if I've fully recovered intestinally from that. So those are really serious issues that can come up if you're eating raw. So yeah, I mostly cook my food.
Where do you think you got the Salmonella from? Any idea?
It's really hard to know because it has an incubation period, and I would like to think that it came from an undercooked egg, which I know that I did eat during those few days before it came on. But the CDC wants to talk to anyone who has a confirmed diagnosis, and they try to put together the commonalities of any cases that they're coming up with, and they think it was ground beef. That
wasn't fully cooked?
I almost never cook my ground beef. I'll sear it sometimes, but that's the one food that I think cooking it just destroys.
It does destroy it. I don't actually even eat ground beef anymore for that reason, because I don't like it cooked.
Yeah.
And I have concerns about it uncooked. I did a recent podcast with Scott from Carnivore Cast, and we talked about this, and we sort of shared our concern for people eating undercooked ground beef. But it's interesting, and I think the food safety stuff is is crucial, and people need to know about this. If people know my style, they know that I often will eat some raw foods from animal foods. I do eat raw liver from time to time. I do eat raw egg yolks. Again, I don't recommend that. Be careful. But I think that there's benefits to eating the food raw, and you can get sick. And when people are getting sick, I think we need to pay attention to it, because most of the nutrients, I think, are preserved when we cook it. It's probably fine to cook your foods in general.
Yeah. There's the taste factor too.
Yeah. Well, you like it more cooked.
No, I like it less cooked. But
right.
But I'm just as happy with medium rare to rare steak as I am with carpaccio or something. So every once in a while I really get a craving for raw, and I never want my egg yolks more than medium.
Yeah, I just eat raw egg yolks now. I don't eat the whites ever, and I've talked about that on previous podcasts, but I never cook the egg yolks. Someone on Instagram is sending me brain, and so I'm excited to try that, and I think I will eat it raw. I might try and cook it, but I doubt it.
It's so delicious.
I'm so excited about that.
But I'm interested, you said you don't eat egg whites at all. Is that, is there an idea behind that there's anti-nutrients in it, or where does that come from? Yeah.
The avidin that binds the biotin, and what I noticed personally was that I felt a little different when I ate the egg whites. Even if I cooked them, I felt a little nauseous. I didn't feel quite as good GI-wise. They never really sit totally well with me. And my diet is so consistent day to day that I think that's what's going on, because I can vary one thing and kind of see, and then the yolks just are so good. And I would not eat the whites raw because of the avidin that would bind the biotin. That's a good way to get a biotin deficiency. And the yolks I enjoy undercooked raw all the time. Yeah, yeah. And in terms of the food safety stuff, any contaminants on eggs are on the shell.
Right.
So by eating the yolk raw, the white may touch the shell. The yolk really doesn't touch the shell at all. I'm not very concerned about food contaminants on the yolk if I throw the white away. I don't like throwing food away, but I don't have a use for the white. I suppose some people use it for like shampoos or something, and maybe I could use that. But at this point, I'm just sort of pouring one out for my homies with the egg whites all the time.
Yeah, I feel a little guilty about that. My children really like meringues.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
So I'll make that for them, but then, that's eating it.
It is eating it. So your story really began in college. Mm-hmm. And you had depression and weight gain, then you went keto, lost weight, and then had the onset of kind of the hypomania, almost a bipolar 2. Were you diagnosed with bipolar 2?
Yes, exactly.
Many years later, and then it was so interesting to hear you say that within a few days, 2 weeks of eating meat, you had an improvement in your symptoms, and your mood was more stable, and your husband noticed it. How? What do you think was going on there? I'm just curious your impression. We can make guesses, and I can make some guesses too, but what do you think is going on there? Because that defies Western medicine, right? If I presented your case, I just finished residency. If I presented your case in residency, I think the whole room would be dumbfounded. They would say, we have no idea. What do you think was going on?
Yeah, I mean, and some people would say, oh, she must have been misdiagnosed, or, it didn't happen in some form or other. I don't know. So there are really two benefits as far as I can figure. One is plant removal, and one is meat increase, right? I was already eating meat. I wasn't doing any kind of low meat version of low carb, but there was definitely an increase. So I think the plant removal part is absolutely essential. I don't know, there are many different ways that every plant's different, and every plant has its own arsenal of chemicals that could be getting through. And I figure, it took me a long time to jump on board with the idea of intestinal permeability, in part because I didn't see bipolar disorder as being a form of autoimmune. These days I'm open to the idea that it could be. And secondly, my idea about intestinal permeability was that it was affected by things like lectins that had been long out of my diet. So I didn't really even give it a second thought. But these days I think it may be the case that if my gut is not distinguishing well, it could be letting through components in plants that for other people they can eat them safely because they don't get into the system the way that they do it for me. It could be that. The meat side of it, I think when you're getting so much more elements like carnitine and carnosine and tyrosine and glutathione, all these elements, it's so funny. We talk about, or other people talk about, how plants have all these unsung nutrients. They're unsung because they're non-essential, right? All the ones that are like that in meat, generally a nutritionist will look at meat and say, oh, that's protein, or that's protein and fat. But there's so much more going on in meat nutrition that we don't acknowledge. And not only is it's not like those phytochemicals in plants, which may have benefits in certain situations but are non-essential. These are actually essential things that we need in our bodies. So I think that could also have played a role.
I think that point is not emphasized enough. I'm working on one of those chapters in my book, and I'm talking about carnosine, carnitine, and taurine, and choline as well.
Yes.
And many of these are nutrients that really do not occur outside of the animal kingdom. And yet, we're never taught about them in elementary school. We're never taught about them as crucial nutrients. The body can make them, but essentially, if we look at the biochemistry, we can't make enough of them.
Right.
And there are so many things in our lives that deplete these nutrients that we can't make enough of them. And if we look at studies of vegetarians and vegans, they all have lower levels of these compounds. Carnitine has been specifically studied in depression. Carnosine has been studied as an antidote or something that attenuates advanced glycation end products and oxidative stress. And no one ever talks about the unique compounds in animals. I think, who was I talking to? Ken Berry. He said, we need a name for these. He wanted to call them zoonutrients or zoonutrients. I thought that's great. Just like we have phytonutrients, which I would argue are sort of a myth.
Right.
In my talk I talked about phytonutrients today being like the tooth fairy, Sasquatch, and unicorn farts. I really don't believe there's such thing as phytonutrients. As you highlight, I am not convinced by any of the literature that there are unique nutrients in plants that we need or that make us any better. But zoonutrients, I think, are the new magic, and we need a good name for this. Maybe you and I and Ken will have to sit down and figure this out. But I would say, there are really cool things in animals, and we're never told about all these amazing things in animals that we can't get in the plant kingdom.
Taurine also has a lot of literature behind it. It's almost like a miracle drug when you give people taurine, and I think that it's probably just the case that they're deficient. Because, like you said, we make them, but I think that evolutionarily we expect to get some from the diet and to make up some, to make up the whole amount that we need. And so I imagine that most people on a Western diet are actually chronically depleted in things like taurine and choline, all the other ones you mentioned.
And I'm sure you've seen the studies in vegetarians where they supplement them with 5 grams of creatine per day and they get smarter and have better working memory. If there's not an argument to eat meat, I don't know what is. If you give vegetarians creatine, which is something that we make in our bodies, it's a product of methylation, but it occurs naturally in meat. A pound of meat, I think, has about 5 grams of creatine, maybe a little bit more. And 5 to 10 grams of creatine in our diet will pretty much saturate what we can use. But isn't it interesting that you give a vegetarian 5 grams of creatine and you can see clear improvements in working memory and complex computational tasks? I mean, there's multiple studies that show this. So that's another one. It's all the C's: carnitine, choline, creatine.
It's funny. Those ones are all named after meat. So creatine is like the Greek for creature, and carnitine obviously is carni, and taurine is from bull.
Yeah, and carnosine.
Yeah,
it's true. And so we're putting the flag in the sand right now. Like, there are magical nutrients in animals for sure, and unless we eat animals, we won't get them. And so you bring up a great point. When you made your transition to more of an animal-based diet or an entirely animal-based diet, it can be the removal of plants, or it can be all these really cool things in meat, or it can be both.
Right.
And I think people will benefit from both or either. And I've talked about that a little bit, the idea of being carnivore-ish. If people don't want to be full carnivore, including more animal products will be beneficial. Eliminating the plant products that's triggering them will probably also be beneficial.
Yeah, I'm not really very hard-assed about eliminating all plants, except for, and I think it's really valuable to have an initial period in which you eliminate a whole slew of potential suspects at once, so you can find out really quickly if this is going to help you. Even that doesn't do everything because some people have histamine issues and other things going on. But if you take it down just to meat, even for a short period of time, it gives you so much more of a baseline that you can compare. And then, if you want to have asparagus in your life, you can find out if that's something that the cost is low enough for you that you can do it.
I think that's such a powerful experiment, and I think elimination diets are the most powerful intervention in functional medicine and root cause medicine, and people can do them in multiple ways, but I can't think of a more powerful intervention than distilling it down to a super simple animal-based diet, whether it's all meat or meats and organ meats or something. That helps people separate signal from noise, and I think that is such a powerful thing. Many people will note, now I see foods that trigger me, and they'll say, oh, I'm more sensitive to these foods now. And I think, no, you just know you're more sensitive to the foods now. That is such a powerful intervention.
Right. You may be more sensitive. It could be that you got habituated, but I actually think that the larger component is exactly that signal to noise. And then, if you do decide, either I found out that this particular vegetable doesn't bother me and I'm going to eat it, or if you say, it bothers me, but I love it so much that I'm going to have it every once in a while, that's, carnivory has no moral attachment. No one's here saying, it's bad for you to eat plants, and so if you eat them, then that shows that you're a bad person. And I think, some other food communities that I might mention really have a moral agenda where if you have even a little bit, then you're betraying this community, and carnivory is not like that.
No, and I appreciate that about carnivory, and I make a conscious effort to follow suit and to not be dogmatic about it and to help people understand that it's not a belief system. It's a spectrum, and it's an ideology that we're trying to create more optimal health. And if we move along the spectrum, we can do that to varying degrees without any fear of retribution. If we eat a vegetable, it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. Now, one of the concepts that you have created or sort of thought about a lot, which I think is really important, and you're writing a book about this, is the idea of humans as facultative carnivores.
Yes.
I know that you have a couple of chapters of your book, which is called Facultative Carnivore online. What does it mean to be a facultative carnivore? I gave you a shout out in my talk today about that, by the way.
Thank you, and I'm so glad that you asked. Well, it sounds like a technical term, is a bit jargony, but I really like the term because as opposed to an obligate carnivore, well, every term has different ways of using it. Let me back up a little bit. There's a certain sense in which we are obligate carnivores. We need meat to thrive, and meat is, I don't think it's fair to say that meat is an optional food. But normally when you think of obligate carnivores, you're talking about basically felines, animals that don't really have any use for plants. On the other hand, if you look at, say, a dog can actually survive for a time eating only plants, and they can do quite well eating a mix of meat and plants, but they don't really reach their full potential unless they're getting at least some meat in their diet. And that's the way that I feel humans are. If you just say omnivore, then it makes it sound like everything's fair game. And that's never really the case. Some foods are better than others.
If you say omnivore, it makes it sound like all food is equal value.
Right.
Which I think is very misleading.
It is, exactly. It is very misleading. So, if you go to a buffet, there are some foods that you're going to prefer. You're not going to like them all equally. And there are many components that go into your preference. But if you talk about biological preference in that same way, there are things that are okay, and then we can get nutrients out of plants, no doubt. They're very useful. But if you really want to thrive, you need meat as a human. And so that's what I mean by facultative.
And I've talked about this as well. In my perspective, plants are survival food. And again, none of us can know. I'm hoping that I will be able to build a time machine, but I may need your help with this because I don't have it working yet. But when I build a time machine, you and me and Sean Baker and William and Chris Bell are going to go back in time, and we can see what people were eating. And we'll do the research, and we'll come back and we'll tell everyone. Maybe we'll just stay back there because it'll be better, but who knows?
But until we have the time machine, we can't really see. So all of what I'm saying is conjecture. But I would imagine that because animal foods are such a better source of these nutrients, that we would only have eaten plant foods when we couldn't get animal foods. But we're so cool as humans, we're so crafty evolutionarily, that we can eat some plants and we can get some nutrients out of plants. So we don't die if we can't get animals. But you're highlighting a really important point here, and I talked about this in my talk today. The bioavailability of nutrients between plants and animal foods is not even in the same ballpark.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah. Especially if you're going to include liver. I mean, liver is a powerhouse.
And I think that it's, people are using Chronometer now, and they're using apps to say, am I getting my nutrients? And they might look at macros, but they're also looking at micronutrients. And I feel like this is wrong, because no Chronometer, no MyFoodPal is going to be able to tell you how much of those nutrients you are absorbing. And the idea that we are absorbing way less of the minerals in plants because of phytic acid, and I would argue way less of the B vitamins in plants because they're bound to glycoproteins, which suggests that we should, if you did that calculation with Chronometer, a diet that has plants in it would look a lot less appealing from a micronutrient perspective. Do you think that's a reasonable statement?
Oh, absolutely. I have a lot of problems with the RDA approach, and one of them is that it doesn't take into account anti-nutrients. So you have this idea where you're adding everything up, and everything that you add in is supposed to add extra value. But there are things you can add in that are actually going to subtract value. It is a very serious problem if you've got phytates or fiber even from a high grain diet that's completely different. And that speaks to, these RDAs were all based on high grain-based diets. And so if you've got an RDA for zinc, for example, you take out the fiber and the phytates, do you think you actually need the same amount of zinc? I think even vegetarians have something like 50% more need for zinc than a standard American diet. So imagine if you took away all the grains, how much zinc you would need. So that's another problem that we don't know how to compensate for. And then the third thing that I think is maybe even the most important about RDAs is this is going to sound funny, but RDAs were not actually designed to identify adequacy. They were defined to identify inadequacy. And it's a little subtle, but what that means is if you're not meeting the RDAs, put it the other way, if you are meeting the RDAs, it's very, very likely that you're getting all the nutrients that you need. But you can't reverse it. If you don't get the RDAs, it just means you're a little bit more likely. So it's a spectrum where the RDA is trying to cover all your bases with a worst case scenario. And I personally don't think I'm a worst case scenario person. So do I need to meet the RDA for all of these nutrients? Probably not.
There are definitely some nutrients, like thiamine, for instance, where I think it's pretty clear humans don't need as much thiamine on a low carbohydrate diet, because we use thiamine up when we do carbohydrate-based reactions like glycolysis.
Right.
And so that, I think, is a clear case of that, and many of these other ones may need to be adjusted. So it really skews the whole equation. And I love what you said about fiber. People imagine fiber to be so magical. And in fact, there are plenty of things that I've talked about in the past where elimination of fiber improves GI symptoms, but also this notion, and there's plenty of good stories, or I should say stories and clinical evidence to suggest that fiber impairs the absorption of nutrients. Just like phytochemicals, just like polyphenols do, fiber impairs the absorption of nutrients. So by increasing the fiber in our diet, we are decreasing the bioavailability of foods. None of these apps can account for that. The more fiber we're having, the less nutrients we're going to absorb. So now how does fiber look as some magical thing, right? It's such a different perspective. And the same thing with tannins, these polyphenols that everybody thinks are amazing, those are digestive enzyme inhibitors. They're inhibiting the absorption of nutrients too. So the landscape is changing and shifting underneath our feet in incredible ways. Are there other nutrients that you think of that are probably very different on a ketogenic or low carbohydrate diet? I can think of thiamine, maybe vitamin C. We can talk about that.
Vitamin C for sure. It's one I've looked into a lot, and the puzzle is that meat is actually an anti-scorbutic. Not only does it have vitamin C in it, but it actually prevents or cures, it actually cures scurvy, and that's been known for centuries. So because it doesn't have a lot of vitamin C in it, that's a bit of a puzzle, right? And even, we're talking about explorers who were not low-carb dieters. You give them some meat and their scurvy goes away. So I started looking into how that could be possible, and one of the things that I think might be actually really important is carnitine. Because the reason we need vitamin C mostly is to make collagen and to make carnitine. The first symptom of scurvy is fatigue. And if you think about it, the main use of carnitine is to shuttle fat into your mitochondria. And if you can't get the fat into your mitochondria, and even high-carb dieters need to burn fat, right? So yeah, you're going to be tired. And if you suddenly eat a couple pounds of meat, and you're getting all this carnitine, it relieves the pressure and the need to use that. So vitamin C is definitely one that I could probably talk about for an hour.
No, maybe we should talk a little more about vitamin C. It's such a fascinating one because, you know, after the talk I gave today, somebody came up and said, what about Linus Pauling's theory? And I was like, okay, well, let's talk about it. Apparently, Linus Pauling had this theory that atherosclerosis or plaque formation was due to vitamin C deficiency, and I thought, I've never seen any evidence to suggest that. And Linus Pauling was of the opinion that we needed tons and tons of vitamin C, and that vitamin C was the panacea, and we could just take 50 grams, 50,000 milligrams of vitamin C, and we would all be healthy. But I have not seen that borne out in clinical practice, and I've seen evidence that high doses of vitamin C become toxic, and that vitamin C becomes a pro-oxidant at high doses.
Yeah.
So this idea, I think we've got the vitamin C story all wrong, and I agree with you that there's evidence that we need vitamin C to make carnitine and collagen. The other symptoms of scurvy are inadequate collagen formation. But I'm not convinced that we need even 100 milligrams of vitamin C per day.
No. So first of all, I want to respond to that thing about heart disease?
Yeah.
So there's a theory, I don't remember the authors of the papers that I read, but there's a theory from a few decades back that metabolic syndrome, both diabetes, and it makes a little more sense for diabetes maybe, and heart disease are forms of latent internal tissue scurvy, which is really interesting. And there are some commonalities, and you can imagine, diabetics don't heal very well, and wound healing is something that would be compromised if you don't have enough vitamin C. It's an interesting line of thinking, but I actually think that insofar as there is inability to get vitamin C to the tissues, maybe it has to do with glucose versus vitamin C. They compete for uptake in certain situations. But the idea, I think Pauling's idea was that the reason we don't make vitamin C internally is an evolutionary mistake. And mistakes happen, but often when there's an evolutionary change like that, there's actually an advantage. And especially vitamin C requires, I think, several simultaneous mutations. You can't just, it's built up over time. So there was time for maybe some reversal, but instead it was actually reinforced. And I'm thinking that there must have been some reason that our vitamin C levels were suddenly dependent on exogenous sources and not just endogenous ones. But you said something else, and I've lost track of what I was going to say. Oh, the 100 grams. So the antiscorbutic dose of vitamin C is only like 10 grams, right?
Or perhaps less. I mean, nobody's ever done the study. The studies from Sheffield, the conscientious objectors use 10 milligrams as the lowest dose.
10 milligrams, yeah, I said grams.
Yeah, 10 milligrams is the lowest dose. And I mean, I wonder if they use 5 or 2 or 3. Like, we don't actually know at the low end.
Right.
But my impression is that we can get 15 milligrams of vitamin C in 3/4 of a pound of muscle meat or something like that. I mean, what's your sense of how much vitamin C we can get where in the animal?
I think 10 is something like 1.5 pounds, but that was when I made that estimate, it was conservative. It was based on like the worst result that I could find. And then I think, glutathione spares vitamin C, and you're going to get some of that, and maybe the ketogenic situation increases that. But the RDA, I don't even remember if it might be 60 or 90.
70, something like that, yeah.
It's very inflated, but if you go back to the literature on how they came up with that, they based it on the idea that you're trying to prevent heart disease by adding antioxidants. And that's such a misguided idea that, I don't know, I really think we should, I can understand why you would want to put preventive measures in the RDA. It makes sense at a certain level because you're not just thinking about what you need today, but you want to live a long, healthy life. But on the other hand, when they're looking at these kinds of preventive measures, the evidence is just very speculative. And so to say we need 60 milligrams of vitamin C a day based on some kind of speculative theory, I think is a little irresponsible.
And we don't see it clinically in the carnivore community. I haven't supplemented with vitamin C in months and months and months and months.
Do you have metabolic syndrome?
I don't think I do. I've certainly checked my fasting insulin, my lipids, and I don't have petechiae or inadequate production of collagen. And I've never heard of a case of scurvy in the carnivore community. And the flip side is also sort of curious. I know at Paleomedicina, they actually discourage people from taking vitamin C supplements. And there's this idea like maybe taking ascorbic acid is going to inflame the gut. So we don't even know. But I think it's very clear that if we're eating fresh animal meat and even organs, which are a really good source of vitamin C, liver has more, brain has a ton, that will easily meet enough for adequacy for a human for vitamin C. I don't think it's an issue in any way, shape, or form. And the idea that megadosing vitamin C is a panacea, I've never seen evidence to suggest it. And I've seen evidence to the contrary, especially informed by cases of like G6PD deficiency, glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, in which when we give large doses of vitamin C, people get hemolysis of the red blood cells.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so G6PD is an enzyme in the red blood cells that recycles NADPH. Because the red blood cells have to have glutathione. And in order to recycle glutathione, they need NADPH.
Okay.
But there's an enzyme, glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, that recycles NADPH so that you can keep making glutathione. And this is favism. Have you heard of favism with fava beans?
Yes,
And that's
I have.
G6PD deficiency. So fava beans have a compound that's a pro-oxidant molecule. And people with G6PD cannot recycle glutathione in the proper way in their red blood cells. So
Are you saying they don't make that enzyme?
They don't make that enzyme. Mm-hmm. So they're the canary in the coal mine for oxidative stress.
Interesting.
And what you see is when they eat fava beans, they'll get hemolysis. And I wonder if anyone's ever looked at hemolysis related to things like other pro-oxidants, in those people. If you give someone with G6PD high doses of vitamin C, they will get hemolysis.
Interesting.
1 gram, 2 grams of vitamin C can cause hemolysis in someone with G6PD, to me suggesting that's a pro-oxidant, And so that's an interesting idea, that they will get these rupturing because they can't regenerate glutathione enough.
Right.
And then they get hemolysis to red blood cells. So,
wow.
And thiamine is the other one. We don't need
you
thiamine.
can talk about iodine. So iodine is almost exclusively used for making T3.
Right.
And T3 levels are lower on a low-carb diet because T3 is needed in response to glucose metabolism. So if you're making, half as much T3, do you really need the same amount of iodine?
Mm-hmm. There's actually a decent amount of iodine in egg yolks.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, and then the sea salt. So
we definitely need some, and I think especially in this community and in the paleo community, there can be a risk of iodine deficiencies if you're not eating traditional conventional salt where they've iodized it.
Right.
So that's good to know.
Now, the other thing that I've heard you talk about a little bit that lots of people listening may be interested in is the idea of a carnivorous diet for kids. When you had your pregnancies, were you ketogenic?
No. So I had been low carb since long before my first pregnancy, but I have a familial condition which is called hyperemesis gravidarum, which is extreme nausea and vomiting of pregnancy. Now, I come from a long line of people with this, and I have to say that I never had it nearly as badly as most of my female relatives, but I still had a lot of nausea, and there were times during my pregnancies where I basically was eating for, will this stay down or not?
Right.
I also, and this is probably not that surprising, given that in the first trimester of pregnancy, insulin levels surge. And I think the idea the idea of the body is you need to get fat now. And so to me, that translated to you need carbs now. And I craved them intensely, and I eventually capitulated in all of my pregnancies to a lot of high carb eating. However, I always returned to low carb, and in the third case to carnivore as soon as that was done.
And then I think I heard you say in the talk that your kids have kind of dabbled with the diet.
Well, my kids were all brought up on a basically a low carb diet at home. By the time I had my third child, I had already had this carnivore experience, and I was eating a carnivore diet. When he was born, I went back to a strict carnivore diet, and when I weaned him onto animal foods. He didn't have almost any sources of plants until he was at least 2. He had had some pumpkin and some baker's chocolate. He went to a childcare place, and they were giving snacks of fruit at snack time. And I thought, well, I think he has a healthy-based diet, and the fruit's probably not going to hurt him, and why should I make him feel excluded? So I let him participate in this, and he immediately broke out into rashes. And I thought, okay, maybe he doesn't need that after all, and I started sending him. But through some trial and error, he and his brothers, I found that they tolerated certain plants much better than others, so they could eat carrots with no bad results, and even bell peppers, which are nightshades technically, but they're so mild, they probably don't have a lot of the active ingredients that make nightshades a problem for so many people.
And I've heard you speak in talks about the fact that kids and babies go into ketosis really fast.
It's super important. And I just realized something by listening to Jillian Scholas today, because she was talking about breastfeeding, and she brought up something that I hadn't really thought about. And that is that the birth experience gives you brain trauma. I mean, you've got this head that's going through.
Squeeze.
Yeah. And so they go into ketosis immediately. And it's really important for them and I've talked about before about how they're growing their brain out of that. In fact, if you look at almost any mammal, they will have ketosis of suckling during the period that their brain growth is happening. But for all those other animals, there's this really interesting correlation where brain growth stops and weaning happens. And I don't know how there might actually be a causal connection there. But human babies, our brains don't stop growing at weaning. We've got something special going on. And so if we're in this ketogenic state as babies, and it's not, like epilepsy therapy level ketosis, it's mild ketosis, more like something you'd have on carnivore, really.
Yeah.
If you're in ketosis while breastfeeding and then you transition onto a high carb food, the ketosis is going to stop. But if you happened to wean onto foods that are not high carb, you're probably going to stay in mild ketosis. The younger you are until you're an adult, the more ketogenic you are, the more ability you have to make ketones. And I think it actually has everything to do with the relative size of your brain. So we know that as adults, we're using about 20% of all our energy at rest goes right to our brain. That's a huge demand. Now think about proportionally what a baby looks like and what their head looks like is like a third of their body or something, right? So how much energy does that need? And then we're actually physically using some of those ketones. Ketones are the bypass for the blood-brain barrier. There's a little bit of fat that can get through, especially the long-chain fatty acids that are important for our brain, but most fat isn't getting through the blood-brain barrier. So I think of ketones as the transport form, get the fat past the blood-brain barrier into the brain, and then you can use it not only for energy, but also it's used to make cholesterol in situ and to make fatty acids in situ, which is what our brain is made of.
That's what our brains are made out of. I did a podcast recently with Tommy Wood, who does a lot of neonatal research. I believe he's neonatology. He's got so many degrees.
I didn't know that about him. He's a really great person.
Yeah, he's amazing. Shout out to Tommy Wood. He's at UW, and I was hanging out. I was there for residency, and he told me the same thing because we were talking about why LDL goes up on a carnivore diet, or why LDL goes up on a ketogenic diet. And he said, oh yeah, of course LDL goes up because the pathway for ketones and cholesterol is the same. We know this because that's what babies use when they're making cholesterol in their brains. And of course, and I talked to Nadir Ali last week about this and about the fact that ketones and cholesterol share the same pathway in the liver, the mevalonate pathway. And so when we have ketones in our bodies, we're going to make more cholesterol. And in some ways, that's probably an evolutionary adaptation from our early life so that ketones can pass and we can make cholesterol to make the membranes in our brain. So it's probably a very good thing that we're so ketogenic. So I've always wondered, I don't have kids, and I think some people are worried about the political implications of having a kid be on a carnivore diet. You have to feed your kid vegetables, or, Health and Human Services is going to come and take them away. But
yeah,
I imagine that a ketogenic diet or periods of ketosis are totally evolutionarily consistent for children as well, and probably totally safe.
Yeah. Humans are uniquely able to be ketogenic. One of the wonderful things about humans is that we can eat more than the minimum amount of protein and stay in ketosis. And I think that's really important to think about the implications of that. So you take another animal, I don't think we've studied enough in other primates, and there may be something there, but if you look at, say, rodents, who are the best models that we have for ketogenesis, if you give them more than just barely enough protein, they're immediately out of ketosis. But humans, obviously, you can eat probably 2, sometimes even more, the minimum amount of protein, and you'll stay in ketosis. And I think that has to do with our brains.
And maybe an indication that ketones have some value for us.
Yeah, maybe.
In many ways. I'm hopefully going to have Dom DeAgostino on the podcast soon. People have told me that on a Joe Rogan episode, he quoted a study that I need to find, that as the ketone levels go up, working memory improves. There's some correlation that for every certain amount of increase in ketones, we have a certain amount of increased working memory. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool. I'm sure there's a point at which that becomes, too much, but that's a pretty interesting adaptation. It
is interesting, and I've spoken in the past about how people should be careful about the idea of trying to chase certain ketone levels, right. And is there any more benefit from being in ketosis qualitatively and having more? And, maybe there actually is. The brain takes it up in a hoggish way in the same way it does glucose. The concentration is basically the level it takes up. So maybe more is better in certain cases.
In certain cases. We were talking the other night at the VIP dinner about some cancer cases. People have brought up questions about whether there's a therapeutic level of ketosis that's different in cancer. And there's great, interesting questions about that. Maybe this is a good segue to fat to protein ratios on a carnivore diet. I know this is something you and Josh and many others have sort of been interested in. What do you think about that? I mean, from my perspective, if we push the protein up, we end up in rabid starvation.
Right.
If we're not eating carbohydrates, we know that there are 3 macronutrients. There's fat, protein, carbohydrates, and if we're not eating carbohydrates on a carnivorous or a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, if we push protein too high, we get to rabid starvation. And at the low end, there's inadequate protein, and we get sarcopenia. So we know there's probably a sweet spot for protein. But what are your thoughts about fat to protein ratios? What's ideal? What should we be thinking about?
Well, it's funny because in earlier years, I used to advocate for high protein a lot. And when I say high protein, I just mean more than the minimum, because there was this real fear that if I ate more than the bare minimum, as soon as I reached that threshold, the rest was going to, quote unquote, turn into glucose, which is really oversimplified. And I can see that there's a certain point after which an amount of protein is going to eventually lead to lack of ketogenesis. That's unquestionable. But whether you get to that, what does that mean that you should take your protein levels down to as little as possible? I really strongly felt that was leading people astray, and so I wanted to talk about that. But these days I've kind of come full circle because my position in the protein war pendulum has swung a little bit, because there is absolutely, like you said, a point at which rabid starvation occurs. So historically that has meant that explorers or people living off the land who are getting only lean meat would suddenly become ill. They're having headaches, they're having diarrhea, and most of all, they're ravenous because they have fat hunger. And if you think about that in the context of protein leverage is this idea that if you're not getting enough protein, if your ratio of protein to energy is too low, then you're just going to keep eating until you get the amount of protein that you need, and along the way you're getting all this extra energy, and maybe then you're forcing a hypercaloric situation. But you could say exactly the same thing on the other end of the spectrum. If you have so much protein that you're having fat hunger, then you're gonna become ravenous and keep eating until you get that fat need met. And so, like you said, there's got to be a sweet spot, and I strongly believe that 100% protein or even 60% protein is probably not it. There are satiety factors that come into play, so the satiety research is a little bit hard to comb through because almost all the literature is in mixed diets. And so, yes, protein is more satiating than carbohydrate, but is that really the comparator that we would want to use in the context of a ketogenic diet? No. And I've seen some evidence that seems to point toward protein being more satiating than fat, but I've seen other evidence that points strongly in the other direction on its effect on CCK and on ghrelin. However, you have to give this caveat that none of this research has been done in the ketogenic context, so it could all be wrong. It's hard to say.
The ketogenic context changes everything.
It does.
So are you able to give your sense of what would you say the sweet spot is for protein if you had to give people a range? I've taken a stab at it before, but I'm curious what yours is.
So off the bat, if I didn't know anything else about you, I would say 35% protein by calorie is kind of an upper limit. Mm-hmm. I have always found ad libitum that I have ended up somewhere between, I would say 25 and 35% protein.
By calories?
By calories. That said, I think certain people do really poorly when they get to that high level of protein, and I've been noodling on it for a really long time, and I don't have the answer for sure, but one thing that I've thought about is that maybe if you already are in some kind of situation where, I hate the word metabolically damaged, but I'm just going to use it.
I don't even know what that means. When people say metabolic, what are you talking about?
But what's going to affect, so if you're going to get enough fat, some of it's presumably coming off your own body, right? And so if you say, if you're thinking from a calories in, calories out perspective, then you say, if you're fasting or if you're eating only protein, then the only thing that stands between you and your fat storage is the butter that you're eating. And so it's all a loss. But it turns out that the rate in which you can get fat out of your fat stores is actually limited. So if you have more fat mass, you have more access to fat. So you have an advantage, I guess, in that way. That means if you're leaner, you probably need to eat a little more fat. If you have your insulin to glucagon ratio, it's surely going to affect how much your fat stores are willing to give up fat. But then also, if you and I each have the same insulin to glucagon ratio, maybe my fat tissue is more insulin sensitive, so a little bit of insulin turns off the flow faster for me than it does you. So there's some individuality that may have to do with how far into that diabetic state you got before you intervened.
Yeah, and if we get really granular here, maybe we can talk a little bit about your opinion or your thoughts about the effect of protein on insulin. I mean, this is kind of the question, right?
Yeah.
Does the ketogenic context really change the influence of insulin on protein? I know you've had some thoughts about this.
Yes, well, I think it does, and I think that the main determining factor may be the insulin to glucagon ratio.
Right.
But, Ben Beekman did a beautiful presentation on this at Low Carb Breckenridge, and some of the data that he showed was he's got a low carb context, and your insulin to glucagon ratio is 1.3, whatever the units were, and you took in some protein and the ratio didn't change. But if you look at the context of that study, I think it actually changed a tiny, tiny bit. It didn't change to the decimal points that we maybe care about, but if it's changing a tiny bit, and if you double the amount of protein, it almost reminds me of a compound interest, right? So if you have like a 0.25% interest on some money and you do like one iteration, it's not going to change your value very much. But if you do that day after day after day after day, you can become wealthy on even a small amount of interest. And I think the same is true for protein. If you think about the days as the portions, like there's going to be a point at which it really starts, it throws you into a different area of the graph.
And it gets to be pretty complex for people at this point. You know, insulin is this anabolic hormone, glucagon is kind of the counter hormone, and I've talked to Dave Feldman a little about this too, and maybe what we need to really be measuring in people is the insulin to glucagon ratio to give them a sense of these things. And the overarching question is just how much protein, how much fat, where's the ideal sweet spot? It does seem to me that that's a very valuable ratio to consider for people, and that people should experiment with that. And I've been thinking about more fat recently and have just kind of been playing with numbers around 0.6 to 0.7 grams of protein per day per pound of lean body mass, which is lower.
That's low.
Yeah, which is lower than many people would suggest. I mean, it's per pound. So for me, it would be about 100, 120 grams of protein per day.
Oh, per pound. Okay.
Yeah, per pound, not per kilogram.
Okay.
Yeah. And, you know, just kind of tracking glucose and tracking ketones and kind of trying to see where that sweet spot is. But I think if people are, wow, that's a scream. If people don't know, by now we're recording outside in Austin, so we're getting to hear the birds. But now somebody's on a scooter and being very excited. I'm just trying to figure out how I feel differently. I've had a number of people actually at the conference, maybe some confirmation bias, come up and say they felt a little better when they added more fat to their diet. And this kind of gets into this idea that protein. I was talking to Mark Sisson a little bit about this. Does protein even really have calories?
It really shouldn't. I mean, a little bit. There's inevitably some loss. Some of it gets metabolized. I was looking at a paper, and I wish I could find it again, actually. It was several years ago. And they were looking at different levels of protein intake, and they showed that the more protein you eat, the more you use, and the more you waste. So it's not linear. And you eventually get diminishing returns where more is wasting. So it's not like your body says, oh, I've just detected that we have enough, and now the rest of it is going into sugar. There's always a bit of both, but the relative values of what's being metabolized versus what's being used starts to increase with your intake.
I think it's a relevant question for people on carnivore and ketogenic diets because of this notion of caloric adequacy. I was talking to a few friends yesterday and talking about how many calories they were getting and how much protein they were getting. And it's almost like the idea of different nutrients from plant and animal sources, that if we are counting protein calories and we're getting a lot of calories from protein, people could maybe become calorie deficient on these diets. I would say that we may be underestimating the amount of calories that we're giving our body if we're doing a high protein diet. Because my suggestion would be that fat is actually what the fuel is. Protein is the building blocks. This is an oversimplification, but my concern is that people who are struggling on carnivore, if they're doing too much protein, not enough fat, may actually be calorie deficient in terms of fuel. Does this make sense? That
right, so they're counting some of those, the protein as calories, which they're not actually getting.
If they're doing 200 to 300 grams of protein, 200 to 300 grams of protein per day, which is not unusual on a carnivore diet, and they're saying that's part of their calories.
That's an excellent point. I hadn't thought about it.
And then you readjust and you say, well, wait a minute, maybe because we've always been taught protein is 4 calories per gram.
Right.
But what if it's not?
That's just its potential.
Yeah, and what if it's not? What if it's only 1 or 2 or 0.5? Then you have to recalculate that whole thing, and now somebody has potentially, 800 calories less in their diet per day. Well, now maybe they're caloric deficiency, and that's why they're not having a period or their menstrual cycle changed or something, in which case my thinking was, okay, dial down your protein, increase your fat, and see what happens. Not necessarily because the extra protein is toxic, but because the extra protein is filling up space in your diet and creating so much satiety that you can't get the fat you need. I like that you brought up the idea of fat hunger. I think people need to be aware if they're doing carnivore diets or thinking about it, they may actually become fat hungry if they do too much protein.
Yeah. The times that I have tried protein-sparing modified fasts, I got so irritable and so hungry for fat. It was just, it couldn't work for me.
It's such a cool concept. And Miki Ben-Dor told me that I've heard him say humans are fat hunters.
Yes.
And he told me in the interview I did with him, I need to post this paper I have. He's published a paper where in many indigenous cultures, the greeting is plenty of fat. The greeting is translated as plenty of fat. When
I'm going to start saying that from now on.
Plenty of fat. It's like blessings. It's like, hey, good day, plenty of fat. Oh, it's such a cool thing. And when you think about it, plenty of fat is probably the signal for us as in terms of nutrient adequacy or caloric adequacy, abundance as humans.
Prosperity.
Yeah. Amber, thank you for coming on today. What a good conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me. What a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been so great to have you. I'm so glad we could connect in person. Where can people find more of your stuff? What are you excited about in the future?
I have a few more conferences coming up this summer. I'll be speaking at Keto Fest on the notion of anecdote. I want to see if we can save the baby out of the bathwater with that. I'll be talking at the Ancestral Health Symposium on uric acid and different theories of why we evolved the way we did.
Which may connect with vitamin C, perhaps.
It does.
I'll be excited for that one. Okay.
And you can always find me on Twitter. I spend way too much time there. My handle is Keto Carnivore. And if you have a question or want to get connected with some of my previous work, you can ask me there.
Okay. And then people can read your book online or the first chapter, right?
Yes, I'm releasing it as I go. It's called Facultative Carnivore, and I'm also making audio versions at a podcast provider near you.
Okay. Do you have a Patreon or any way people can support your work?
I do, yes. Please find me on Patreon.
Amber O'Hearn on Patreon.
Yes.
Okay. I'll put links to that stuff in the show notes. All right, you guys, we're going to wrap this one up. Stay radical.
All right. That's a wrap. I so much appreciate Amber. I appreciate her coming on to the show. I appreciate her presence in the carnivore community. I appreciate her for everything she has contributed. So please show her some love. Check out her blogs, Empirica, which is EMPIRI.ca, and ketotic.org. Also check out facultativecarnivore.com. She's putting out the chapters of her book as she is writing them on that website. She's speaking at so many cool conferences. She's an amazing woman, and I am so grateful to have connected with her. We have conversations pretty frequently now about cool ideas. I call her up and I say, Amber, what do you think about this? And we have an awesome idea, and I always think I should have recorded them all and perhaps addended it into this podcast, but I didn't. So maybe in the future we will do more. I certainly hope so. Check out The Insider, you guys. Fundamental Health Insider. It's my spot. It's my jam. paulsaladinomd.com/insider. And then check out ancestralsupplements.com and check out Joovv, www.joovv.com/Paul. I really like their stuff. I'm going to be talking about it way more. And if you guys are still listening, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I am going to the Center for Deuterium Depletion in Los Angeles soon, and I am stoked. I'm going to hang out with Laszlo Boris. I'm going to record a podcast up there. I'm going to learn about what they're doing. I'm going to hang out with Dr. Q. We're going to do some really cool stuff. There's a lot of people thinking that perhaps near-infrared light, red light affect deuterium, and I think it's a fascinating concept. There's a lot more to learn here. So anyway, that's it for all this stuff, you guys. You know you should stay radical. Thank you for support. Oh, one more thing, if you're still listening, there's probably like 3 of you still listening in total, but that's okay. I'm not going to answer any DMs anymore on Instagram. Support me on Patreon if you want to ask me questions. That is the way to do it, you guys. I appreciate you all. I love you all. I'll see you next week. Peace.